Well, good morning, and can I welcome everyone to this, the 13th meeting of the Public Audit Committee in 2025. We have apologies in this morning from the Deputy Convener, Jamie Green. Agenda item 1 is to decide whether to take agenda items 3, 4, 5 and 6 in private this morning. Is the committee content to do that? We are agreed. Thank you very much. And our main item for evidence this morning is consideration of the work programme of the Auditor General for Scotland for the year April 2025 to March 2026, which is effectively taking us up to the next Scottish Parliament election. So I'm very pleased to welcome this morning joining us at the committee Stephen Boyle, the Auditor General, and alongside the Auditor General this morning is Alison Cumming, who's an Executive Director, Performance Audit and Best Value at Audit Scotland, and also Mark McPherson, who is an Audit Director at Audit Scotland. We've got quite a number of questions to put to you this morning, Auditor General, but before we get to those, can I invite you to make a presentation? Thank you.
Convener, many thanks indeed, and very grateful for the committee's time this morning to discuss and consult with you on my proposed work programme. Convener, the audit work that I plan to undertake reflects my overall priorities until the Scottish Parliament elections next year, together with a forward look at key themes for scrutiny for the new Parliament after May 2026 elections. As the committee knows well, the current context for the Scottish Government and public services in Scotland remains challenging. Rising demands, together with a constrained financial outlook, pose risk to the sustainability of public services in their current form. A clear vision, together with strong leadership, are required to drive the reforms needed to ensure the sustainability of services into the future. The committee has, of course, explored many of these issues in its evidence-taking during this parliamentary term. It's critical that public money is raised and spent to best effect, and that we get the very best value from publicly funded services. This includes the people delivering services, the land and buildings that are owned by the public sector, and the technology that public sector bodies use to deliver those services. This is what drives my thinking about my future programme of audit work. I want to ensure that public services target resources effectively, that their financial management is effective, and that public bodies more transparently report on their performance, together with our audit recommendations, driving improvement and having impact. Public audit has an important role to play in supporting improvement and highlighting best practice where we find it. As I have highlighted in many of my audit reports, the scale and pace of public sector reform that is required to support future sustainability has not yet been delivered at pace. This is why I will continue to focus on how public bodies are enabling change, both individually and across the wider systems within which they operate. This includes considering how they are empowering people and communities, reducing inequalities, supporting prevention, and, as I've mentioned, making better use of digital technology. Some parts of the proposed work programme will be familiar to the committee. I will continue to have an interest in public finances, both locally and on a national basis, climate change, health and social care, and economic growth. The committee, of course, will know that I report on the financial audits of Scottish public bodies and highlight matters of public interest that have arisen through the annual audits in Section 22 reports. The number of these reports varies each year depending on the issues that are identified through the annual audits by the appointed auditors. But at a minimum, I intend to continue reporting annually on the Scottish Government consolidated accounts. My work programme needs to be flexible, and I plan to continue to use a variety of audit approaches and reports to highlight my audit findings. As ever, I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss my programme with the committee, and I want to ensure that my work programme considers key areas of interest to the Parliament and that it reflects topics that will add most value to supporting effective parliamentary scrutiny. The focus of this update, as I've touched on, Convener, is in the reports that I intend to bring forward in advance of the Scottish Parliament elections next year. Work is already underway on some of these outputs included in the work programme, and Audit Scotland staff have been liaising, and we're grateful for the time of the committee to ensure that we are planning effectively for the committee's consideration of these key reports in advance of the end of the parliamentary session. Lastly, Convener, I'm at the early stages of formulating the work programme for 2026-27. What I've done today is provided you with some key themes that I intend to develop further into priorities and likely anticipated outputs thereafter. Your feedback and any feedback that you may wish to take from across the Parliament, of course, is invaluable and will help me refine and settle on my priorities and format as I progress over the course of the next few months. Convener, Alison, Mark and myself very much look forward to the discussion this morning and answering any questions you and the committee have.
Thank you very much indeed. And can I begin by looking at the general picture? Because at the very start of what you have just said and in the presentation that you've given to the committee, you really set out pretty clearly the challenges which are being faced by all public bodies, but led by the Scottish Government. And in that, you give a sense that things are not really going in the right direction, because you talk about demand for public services rising at the same time as the financial outlook is challenging and volatile, in your words. You talk about the growing gap between budget forecasts and spending plans and a lack of clarity around that and how that's going to be addressed. The recurring theme throughout your presentation is around the sustainability of public services and the financial sustainability, I think, in particular, but not exclusively that. And fourthly, you also remind us that there are still persistent inequalities which are not being addressed, and the outcomes that people experience show quite significant variations based on where they live, disability, race, the extent to which they're living in an impoverished community and in poverty themselves. So all of these things are posing quite big challenges. I guess the big question then is, how do you think the Scottish Government is responding to those challenges?
Well, I wonder if I can break some of that down, Convener. I think there are so many variables. I think that is, and what I want to do through my work programme is to reflect the environment that Scotland's public services find themselves in. The challenges of increasing demand, inequality, the government's ambition, and we'll hear more of that through the programme for government next week, but their priorities. I think that leads me to, there are some unknowns in advance of us presenting our work programme to the committee this morning. So next month, as the committee heard from the now former Permanent Secretary and his senior team when you took evidence in March, is going to be incredibly busy, but also very important as the government sets out its position on the medium-term financial strategy, the fiscal sustainability delivery plan, together with the public service reform strategy. We want to, as I'm sure you and many others will do too, is really digest those documents. We hope to see the clarity of the government's intention around its deliverables, its view of the financial position. And that remains unpredictable. Indeed, we've only seen perhaps over the past 100 days with the global factors that will influence Scotland's economic position, with imposition of global trade tariffs, of what that might mean for public spending in Scotland in due course. In a UK context, we have the spending review that will take place over the course of the summer. And then thereafter in Scotland, we'll have clarity, and Alison might want to say a bit more about some of this in a moment, about what that means for capital projects through an updated infrastructure investment programme, along with the Deputy First Minister's confirmation that Scotland's national performance framework still requires work. That is, as a useful tool to properly record how Scotland's performing. Is it delivering the government's priorities? Is it addressing the inequalities that you touch on? So it feels that we're in a diagnosis stage at the moment of that work needs to happen to deliver new strategies, new frameworks, but not quite at the point that I think it flows through definitively for our programme, that we're settling specifically on what our programme of work will be for after the Scottish Parliament election. And actually, I think that's okay. I'm content that we've got a programme we're consulting with the committee this morning that takes us up to the election. But over the course of the summer months this year, it allows us to take stock of all of these Scottish factors and then national and international factors before settling on our programme. But I'll pass to Alison, who we want to develop some of that.
Yeah, morning, convener. Just in terms of the forthcoming infrastructure investment plan and the refresh of the pipeline, what we'll be looking very closely at are the methodologies and approaches that government are using to prioritise within the capital envelope. The UK spending review should give greater multi-year certainty than the Scottish Government has had for a number of years to do that planning over at least a 3-year period. We know there's some very significant commitments already being made, an indication of medium to longer term priorities from the government, particularly major roads projects such as the A9. We've got the building of HMP Glasgow, for example. We will be looking very closely to see, as well as considering the prioritisation and evaluation approach for arriving at that capital programme, where the big spend is likely to be, and that will help us make an assessment of where the risks and the main opportunities for public audit to have an impact on the successful delivery of these projects and the value for money that they deliver for the public.
So what's your anticipated timetable for that? Is that something that will be in the public, your analysis of the major capital projects prioritisation, will that be something that you will do some work on that will be in the public domain before the end of this year, for example?
Well, it's all very much subject to the Scottish Government's timetable. I believe at the moment we're most likely to see the Scottish Government probably publish a multi-year spending plan closer to the budget rather than in with the MTFS, because of the timing of the UK spending review. So we will take stock when we see that, but it may be that we build it into our plans for the post the 26 election, depending on the timing of when it comes out, and recognising then the ability of Parliament to scrutinise that work.
Yeah. As you know, we've had previous conversations with you about the medium-term financial strategy being delayed, and it was delayed last year. Is it being delayed this year? Is there going to be a delay in the publication of the major capital projects list? These are matters, I think, of concern to this Public Audit Committee.
Yes, indeed, Convener, actually, and I was with the giving evidence to the Finance and Public Administration Committee yesterday as part of their review of the budget process arrangements in the Scottish Parliament. And it was exactly on those themes as Audit Scotland responded to that committee's call for views on a range of factors how the budget operates, and to support effective scrutiny. But the absence of a medium-term financial strategy approaching 2 years now, in our view, is a barrier to effective parliamentary scrutiny, not to mention public interest and wider stakeholder engagement. I think there are a range of factors, of course, each in isolation are reasonable for a delay, whether these were an economic shock, parliamentary elections in the UK and other factors. But it comes to a point that in totality, we're now nearly 2 years later and we still haven't seen an updated medium-term financial strategy. So I have no reason to doubt the commitments I think that this committee heard from the Director General for the Scottish Exchequer in March, that May remains the intended publication dates for the medium-term financial strategy, together with the Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan. And I think the point I was making to the Finance Public Administration Committee yesterday, Convener, is about alignment, that these publications are clear in how they operate together. They're supported by detailed scenarios that kind of set out how public spending will operate, really building on the evidence that this committee has taken on our report from November of last year on fiscal sustainability. So keen to see that come through.
Okay. Can Can I just, I'm going to bring Stuart McMillan in a second on this, but you used an expression earlier on, so you've just described there about the delays to the medium-term financial strategy and the consequences of that, including for democratic scrutiny, but also for some of the decisions that government needs to make. But you also said in your opening that when it came to things like public sector reform, the government has not yet delivered at pace, which is a very mild criticism, isn't it? I mean, there's an inference there that they could be pressing ahead with that at a quicker rate than actually they are.
So I think that's a comment I'm comfortable making, Convener, based on the evidence that we've seen. Again, referencing the report from last year, where we gave what I think was very interesting and important examples of where public service reform has taken place and done so successfully. So I think the committee will be familiar with many of these, of organisations like Registers of Scotland, Disclosure Scotland, and some of those examples adopting technology successfully. But at the same time, I think neither the pace, perhaps, nor the scale of public service reform have we yet seen that will be necessary to support a sustainable fiscal position in Scotland. And that's born again out of the evidence that the Scottish Fiscal Commission have done in their forecasts, pointing, I think most recently, and Alison might have the most up-to-date numbers of a gap approaching £2 billion by the end of this decade between demand and the consequent expenditure that will be required, together with what's the likely available public finances based on current arrangements. Public service reform will be one of the key levers to deliver a sustainable set of public services in Scotland. And I think, again, it was very important that, as the committee heard from the former Permanent Secretary, that the government's ambitions around public service reform are going to be translated into a public service reform strategy. Again, I think he said this spring, but I think he also went on to say that would be published again in May. So there's a lot happening in May, in real...
And that's just tomorrow, isn't it?
Well, quite. So, together with the programme for government, it's going to be a very busy month, but very important, as to clarity for how public services will be delivered in Scotland.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to bring Stuart in to put a question to you on this area. Stuart.
Thank you very much, Convener. Auditor General, you spoke earlier on regarding the variables in which we're all working with at the moment, but also you touched upon the global factors. I'm keen to have a better understanding in terms of I know you're about audit in terms of the past, but you're looking ahead. In terms of what kind of forecasting work or what kind of activity you would undertake with regards to the service delivery because of global factors and also the global economic shocks that then impact Scotland and the UK's economy. Yeah. I'm thinking one example particular. Recently, obviously, when the President of the US announced what he did, and then the financial markets took a bit of a hit for a number of days, came back a wee bit, but clearly anyone who was retiring at that period of time, their pension funds will have taken a hit, and that will have affected them. So no doubt some of these individuals will have then be required to then utilise more public services earlier at some point in the future as compared to what they would have been planning.
Yeah, good morning, Mr. Millen. I think it's such a relevant factor in anticipating ultimately how it relates to Scottish public finances and what our work. I will bring Alison in a moment. I'm sure she'll want to say perhaps a bit more about how we work with other bodies, particularly the Scottish Fiscal Commission, in capturing their forecasts and what that means for our interests of financial sustainability of individual public bodies and then Scotland's public services as a whole. I agree with your example in terms of what it means for people who are coming up for retirement, what they might mean in the money they then ultimately have available through annuities and so forth. The other example perhaps takes me back to is the committee's consideration of Scottish income tax in the past few months, where, and this is a hypothetical example, but hopefully illustrative of global trade tariffs. Some of those are imposed on Scottish companies, makes their goods more expensive if the US is a primary export market. And that might mean that some Scottish companies consider their growth forecasts, their employment requirements. That could, in those cases, mean less money coming into Scotland, less well-paid jobs in some cases in Scotland. So these are the factors I'm sure that the Scottish Government, together with the Fiscal Commission, will be considering as they work through these forecasts in the next few weeks. And I don't, just before passing to Alison, I don't underestimate the complexity of preparing a medium-term financial strategy in this environment. And I do recognise, Convener, that inevitably there will always be events that will say, well, that means that a forecast document isn't as reliable as we would want it to be. But I think it's a necessary starting point, together with scenarios and variables, to allow that kind of level of scrutiny and discussion. But I think Alison maybe can set out for the committee that in a bit more detail.
Thank you. Yeah, in terms of that relationship that we have with the Scottish Fiscal Commission, our Public Finances team work closely with them to ensure that we have that really robust understanding of the determinants of the forecasts that particularly come through on income tax. And as Stephen has said, that's where there are particular, I think, risks to the Scottish budget in terms of volatility there. The other area, obviously, that the Fiscal Commission is responsible for is forecasting social security spend. And we know that is demand-led. There are other areas, as you've alluded to, of public spend, particularly within health and social care, that is demand-led. And these are areas that can be of particular risk in terms of whether the Scottish Government is able to manage those, any volatility that arises in year or over a number of years, particularly in the case of social security. So a lot of where we will, as well as having that detailed work and understanding with the Fiscal Commission, the auditor to the Scottish Government looks very closely at the assessment of risk that's being undertaken within the Scottish Government, and we would expect to start to see these issues coming through and being reported through the DG assurance meetings that take place up to the Scottish Government level audit committee, and we will use that to influence and inform where we take our audit work based on where we see the risks to the Scottish budget in particular.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We thought it was useful to have some of those kind of scene-setting discussions at the start of this morning's session, but we now do want to get into some of the specifics of the work programme. And can I begin by a report, a Section 23 report, I think, which is coming out into NHS governance. Again in May, which is tomorrow, onwards. And it's been something which has been of concern not just to the Public Audit Committee in this session of Parliament, but in previous sessions of Parliament. There have been, I think, some long-standing concerns about the extent to which leadership governance in the NHS is working as it ought to be. So I guess my first question on this is, do you see, without obviously preempting too much the report you're about to publish, but do you see signs of improvements being made to leadership and governance in our National Health Service?
Thanks, Convener. So, without getting into the detail of it and in advance of the publication, and I'm grateful for setting that scene, we see a really complex picture, and I will pass to Alison in a moment, who's been leading on much of this work, to kind of set out, perhaps in high-level terms, some of the findings from our work. And we wanted to do this piece of audit work because of the nature of the recurring themes that we've seen through our audit report. And I think this committee has heard of what's a really complex landscape, with territorial health boards, national boards in Scotland, now IJBs, how they're operating with Scotland's local authorities, and then the overarching framework that exists with the NHS in Scotland, together with the Department for Health and Social Care, and really looking at that structure, the decision-making, the people who are working within the system, together with the governance frameworks. We have blueprints for good governance within the NHS. Is it possible to navigate through all of that system to make important, complex, sometimes life-changing decisions while with all of that exists. So won't be surprised if Alison can set out in a bit more detail, that we think that's really complicated for not just for auditors, perhaps for parliamentarians, but especially for people working in the system and left with who does it need to operate in the way it does? Is it structured to best effect? So we'll certainly set that out in more detail, I think, over the course of the next few weeks and get into some of that with the committee when we brief you. But I will pass to Alison if she wants to develop that.
Just to develop a few points that you will hear more on. It will be towards the end of the month that this report will be published. What we have been looking is at the national level system, and also what developments there have been in the governance of health boards over the last few years. And we have seen the Scottish Government make some quite significant changes in investment in policies and procedures, the blueprint for governance in boards. There have been self-assessment exercises undertaken, a focus on lessons learned. A lot of our work in the scope of the audit has been interested in how is that governance, those governance arrangements, both within boards, but very importantly, how those come together at national level. How are they fit for the challenges that the NHS in Scotland is facing just now, particularly the ability to deliver the reform that the Auditor-General has identified in the NHS overview and in other reports as being really essential to ensuring services are on a sustainable footing. So that is the lens through which we've looked at this complex issue. We have seen changes at Scottish Government level in the last year or so as well, with changing the way that NHS board chief executives come together in a governance group, and we'll set out more detail on that in our report. But really, some of the themes that will come through about how recognising that a level of complexity is inevitable in health, in running the health service. How can we ensure that the right safeguards are in place around decision making? How do we know that that we've got the right level of independent scrutiny at different levels, both within decisions that are taken at board level and when we take the health system together as a whole, and how Scottish Government oversees the performance of the NHS in Scotland.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about this yesterday and reflecting on the fact Graham Simpson and I are both Central Scotland MSPs, and the two health boards in our areas have seen quite significant changes in leadership in quite a short space of time. I mean, if I think about NHS Lanarkshire, I think the third, and this is not a comment on the individuals at all, but we see the third Chief Executive Officer for NHS Lanarkshire starting next week, and that's the third in 2.5 years. If we look at NHS Forth Valley, if you include the interim CEO, we're on to our third CEO in less than 2 years. So there seems to be quite a lot of turbulence in these leadership positions, and I just wonder whether part of what you are looking at is the underlying reasons for that. Is it about the degree to which they're given the support that they need? Is it a revolving door where people are just moving between health boards, which is one facet potentially of it, and is it creating an instability in the leadership of those territorial NHS boards?
We have looked at this at a fairly high level to manage your expectations for when the report comes through. We have identified issues with turnover and interested in what the NHS is doing in terms of a pipeline of future leaders and thinking about how you build that leadership capacity, coming back to that point of the particular period that the NHS is in. How do you have leaders who are able to not just run the services that are there, but transform them into that more sustainable position? It is an area that's of concern to us, the turnover. We don't just see that in the NHS. The Accounts Commission published a briefing and an output on the financial performance of integration authorities earlier this year, and it highlighted a very significant turnover of chief officers and chief financial officers. So it is something that obviously heightens the risks around delivery and good governance when we do see that very significant turnover.
Yeah. Stephen, do you want to come back in?
Just very briefly, Convener, I'm reminded, I think, of evidence-taking that your predecessor committee took on succession planning arrangements for senior leadership roles within the NHS. I'll correct this if I'm wrong, but I think it was the LIFT programme. I think it was a mechanism that the NHS had devised to support leadership transition arrangements. And the committee took evidence from senior leaders, and I think really illustrating the point I think Alison makes, that these are demanding jobs, but I think what we wanted to get under the skin of in our report is the system operating that can allow them to discharge their responsibilities as straightforwardly as possible, which is in a complex system. So we looked to get into some of that territory, but really kind of overarching basis of how is governance and decision-making and accountability operating within the NHS across the piece in Scotland.
Yeah, we'll look forward to that coming out. But Graham Simpson's got a question, I think.
Yeah. Just a quick question. Will your report be looking at the number of health boards and the value for money that represents?
Not directly. So the number of health boards in Scotland is a policy matter and one of a decision for government, and I'm precluded from commenting on the merits of policy. But I think as the system currently operates, that's what we're looking to explore.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on now to another area which you are going to be reporting on, and that is the adult disability payment, which is administered by Social Security Scotland. You very tactfully say in your presentation that, let me quote you, social security spending is increasingly outstripping Barnett consequentials for Scotland. Well, my reading of the recently published Green Paper by the UK government suggests that's going to get a whole lot worse, isn't it? Because if I read correctly what's being proposed, there are cuts to universal credit and eligibility criteria for that, but I think of more direct bearing on adult disability payment are the proposed changes to personal independence payments, where, again, as I read it, there is an aim in that Green Paper to cut eligibility, assessments based on scores, and I think that the score thresholds to qualify for PIP will rise, and the OBR estimate that 800,000 people will face a minimum cut of £4,200 per annum. So that's the consequentials of that for the Social Security Scotland budget are quite profound, aren't they? Is that reading correct, that the pressures that you have identified where we are now are likely to be exacerbated significantly in the future, let alone looking at the individual consequences for the outcomes for those people who are in receipt of those payments?
I think it's fair to say that's a significant risk for the Scottish Government's financial position. What our audit really looks to do is to, I think as we mentioned in our blurb alongside the planned output, Convener, is that, as you mentioned, the Scottish Government's taken a policy decision around adult disability payment, that some of the eligibility criteria, the processes that clients, I think the terminology that they'll use to access adult disability payment, is distinct from how the DWP operates personal independence plan. And that's very clear in Social Security Scotland's culture of one of respect. The Scottish Fiscal Commission, whose work we will draw on through this audit, have highlighted some of the risks, the financial risks of this approach. And as you mentioned, the context is evolving quite rapidly with some of the decisions that the UK government might take about its funding for personal independence payments and what that might mean through Barnett consequentials. Clearly, the Scottish Government will have choices to make about how it spends its budget, the proportion it allocates to social security, what tax responses it may or may not take as a consequence of all this. But in the round, what audit looks to assess is adult disability payment is the largest of the devolved benefits in Scotland. How well that's been managed, how well it's been assessed, together with the financial and non-financial consequences of this programme. And then lastly, looking at to what extent is the adult disability payment contributing towards the wider efforts to improve outcomes. Whilst there's very timely factors that are happening from a UK context, I think it already builds upon the system that was operating, whereby through deliberate policy choices, Scotland was already paying more for the adult disability payment, and really looking to capture how all of that is operating effectively in the round, both on an individual basis and then some of the fiscal aspects of that too. Just come back to me, Convener. I'm reminded that the Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan, one of the key parts of that will be around social security into the future and how that will be managed, and that feels very timely.
Okay, thank you. Just a minor point in a sense. When you've undertaken these kind of pieces of work in the past, you've often spoken to people with lived experience. So in the work that you are doing and plan to do on looking at Social Security Scotland, the adult disability payment and so on, do you plan to speak to people that are in receipt of that payment to understand how they are affected by the way that it operates?
Yeah, Alison can say a bit more about the scope and methodology. Yeah, I think we endeavour to do that, Convener, to bring people's experiences on occasions, and there are some, I think, in this programme that we might have had to speak to representative bodies rather than individuals because of some of the time constraints that we're operating to. But Alison can confirm.
Specifically for this audit, we're not doing any primary audit work on lived experience for a few reasons. We obviously absolutely recognise the importance, particularly in relation to Social Security Scotland's stated values of dignity, fairness and respect, of understanding the human impact of different approaches. But we're also conscious that there's also a review going on of the effectiveness of adult disability payment that the Scottish Government has commissioned, that I think Adele Harris is leading and is due to report this year as well. So we didn't want to duplicate work that was going on, so our focus has been a little different. We do also have an advisory group for this audit, which includes organisations, and apologies, I don't have the names of the members to hand today, but that includes organisations that represent those with lived experience. So they have been helping us shape the scope of the audit to make sure that while we're not undertaking that primary audit work, all our audit judgments are informed by a good understanding of the evidence that already exists and the work that's been undertaken by these organisations and by Scottish Government on the impacts on people and communities of the different approaches taken by Social Security Scotland.
Okay, I mean, this is the start of a consultation process, isn't it? And I know that other committees of the Parliament may also have a view in some of these areas about what best practice or optimum practice might be when it comes to the work that you're doing. I'm going to move on now, and I'm going to invite Colin Beattie to put some questions to you. Colin.
Thank you, Convener. Firstly, I thought the overall document was quite a good one, quite a strong one, with a lot of good areas that you're picking up there that the committee will be interested in. I'd like to pick on just one or two. IJBs. We've had discussions here about integration authorities in the past, and we've always been concerned about the funding for them and the staffing and the real commitment behind that, and possibly anecdotally the unwillingness perhaps of the NHS to pay their share into the IJBs. Can you tell us a bit more about the work that you're planning on the finance and the performance of the IJBs?
I'll start again and I'll pass to Alison. I'll bring Mark in shortly on other topics. But I think the first thing Alison can say a bit more in detail. I'm very pleased we're doing this work, Mr. Beattie. The committee will know that IJBs are local government bodies, and the Accounts Commission has published extensively on IJBs, but because of the nature of accountability arrangements, That doesn't always filter through to the Public Audit Committee, who receive either joint reports from me in the Accounts Commission or reports that Audit Scotland has prepared on my behalf. The Accounts Commission and I and Audit Scotland produce a joint work programme. So the Accounts Commission have their own programme that sits alongside what you're seeing today. But both the Chair of the Accounts Commission and the other members of the Accounts Commission and I reflected on doing an isolated IJB report perhaps restricts the ability of both the Commission, myself, and indeed through to the Public Audit Committee to see how the system is operating in the round. I think this is a really positive development and will give myself, the Public Audit Committee and the Parliament more of an opportunity to comment on how IJB's position is impacting. It will allow for both the Accounts Commission and myself to make recommendations across the whole system in a single audit report. So very enthused about how this will develop and look forward to presenting it to the Public Audit Committee should you wish to receive that in due course. But I will pass to Alison to kind of talk you through a bit more detail of how this work will unfold.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, we've been, we do see this as one of the areas where we can really get that advantage of the Audit Scotland team supporting both the Auditor General and the Accounts Commission, because we can look across the whole system in this single report. It allows us to build on the work that the Commission has undertaken in recent years, which by necessity has had to focus more either on the local government dimension or on the specific performance measures by which the IGBs are held to account. And we can bring in more of the health indicators and see where, recognising that primary care, for example, is a huge factor in how the overall system on health and social care is operating. We are also taking some quite different approaches with the Integration Authority's work in terms of the presentation of the work. We developed with the Commission a more interactive form of reporting on IGB finances that was published in March this year that allows you to go in and look at performance more closely for an individual IGB, as well as getting the exhibits that we would have in reports that would show that comparative national position. So we are looking at ways that then we can be overlaying that interactive financial tool, how we overlay the performance information when that work is undertaken by the Auditor General and the Accounts Commission. So we can be making, we can be more clearly illustrating some of those connections and the drivers between financial and operational performance. The Accounts Commission has been very clear. I would say the Accounts Commission probably sees social care as its top service area risk in terms of its focus of its work plan and programme. So I would see this being an area of, subject to obviously how the Auditor General wants to proceed with his work programme in future years, but being an area of continued joint interest and being featuring quite significantly in our audit work over the coming years. And that's illustrated, I think, our performance audit, the joint performance audit on delayed discharge that will be published in early 2026 is a way then that we can complement that system-wide look and look at the performance by going deeper on a particular challenge, probably one of the wicked issues facing health and social care around delayed discharge, and bring to life how some of these challenges are actually coming to impact on the efficiency of services, but significantly the outcomes for individuals and their families who are affected.
Certainly, the IGBs are a key point in terms of the primary health care, local health care, which is increasingly under strain.
Yes.
So it will certainly be interesting to see what comes out of that.
And maybe just that, Mr. Beattie, I recently published a report on GP contract in Scotland, and I think giving evidence to the committee in the next couple of weeks. So I think what Alison's illustrating and looking to capture in the programme is the interconnectedness of these issues, whether it's NHS governance, how GP services are operating through to IJBs, and then practical realities of that with delayed discharges in Scotland's hospitals. So almost seeing this as a programme of work through, and then as you'll see also in the programme, continuing our overview of the NHS in terms of its finance and performance as well. So as much absolutely supportive of the Commission's point that social care remains their top priority, and I think you can see that read across into the wider programme from myself here too.
Sounds fair enough. Just to move on slightly, fiscal sustainability is a big thing, and you touched on it yourself earlier on. It's a difficult one. I notice you're going to be looking at the tax policy and the opportunities and risks of using tax as a way to achieve fiscal sustainability. There is a problem, of course, with tax that it's kind of one-sided. You don't have all the levers, so it's difficult to balance the tax across the economy when you don't have control of that. Can you tell us a bit more about your planned work on that, particularly in terms of the tax side, and how it's going to support the work of the Parliament, obviously, but maybe also probably of interest to the Finance and Public Administration Committee?
Yeah, you're right. I'll kick off, actually, and Alison again can say a bit more because she'll actively involved in some of this activity. You're right, of course, what you say is that not all of the taxes that are applied in Scotland are under the control of the Scottish Parliament. So we want to look as to set out in our audit report how all that is operating and make an assessment. Is that operating effectively? Is it clear? For those taxes that are devolved through Scotland, inevitably we'll touch on parts of the fiscal framework, a theme that this committee is very familiar with. And I agree with you. I think, as we hope for many of our reports, is that they are of use and of interest, not just to the Public Audit Committee, but across parliamentary committees. So we would anticipate, and again, as I'd mentioned, I was at the Finance and Public Administration Committee yesterday. I did bring this planned piece of work to their attention as part of their own interest in fiscal sustainability and the budget scrutiny arrangements within the Scottish Parliament. So, but Alison, I think we're at the scoping stages for this piece of work, but we can give you a bit more detail.
Thank you. I mean, part of the reason for the selection of taxes as the focus for a fiscal sustainability piece this year is recognising that it really then almost completes the series with the work that we undertook last year on overall arrangements for sustainability and public service reform. Recognising tax is one of the three pillars in the 2023 medium-term financial strategy that was published by the Scottish Government. It allows us to consider how are the risks and opportunities, the fiscal risks and opportunities around tax policy being managed. We will be building on some of the work that we undertook in the assurance report on Scottish income tax this year, drawing very heavily on the work of the Scottish Fiscal Commission. They are the independent forecasters and the experts in modelling and forecasting these impacts, but looking really at them, what risks to these are there for the Scottish budget and how are these managed. We will, obviously, with the vast majority by value of the taxation revenue that's devolved is Scottish income tax, and that will be a major focus. But in this report, we're also going to look at the fully devolved taxes, land and buildings, transaction tax and Scottish landfill tax, and consider there are distinct arrangements within the fiscal framework for the operation of those taxes, and we will look more closely at those and the plans for further devolution of tax powers. We've got the Parliament has been considering legislation for the Scottish aggregates tax, and we are also looking at probably quite a high level, but with the consultation having been undertaken by the UK government on giving the powers under the Scotland Act for the Scottish Parliament to legislate for a building safety levy, which is the first time that those powers have been used to enable the Scottish Parliament to legislate for a new tax as opposed to a replacement of an existing UK tax. We will look at a high level, given that that's still at an early stage as part of this report as well, but really with a strong focus on the budgetary implications, and both in the short term and how those medium term risks are manifest and being managed.
I think you're expecting to bring this forward in, according to your overview here, November 25.
Yes, that's correct. So we're planning to have, we thought it was important to time both this audit and the audit of adult disability payments, so they were ready to support Parliament's scrutiny of the draft budget when it comes forward. So that's what has influenced our timing of seeking to publish the taxes work in November.
Now, just again, moving on slightly, you're going to be doing a briefing on education and skills reform, which will help inform or provide scoping for audit work after the election. Specifically, I was going to ask a question about colleges here, because they've been very much in the news for a long time now, particularly in respect to their fiscal sustainability. But I notice that in your plans here, you're talking about in October this year bringing forward a briefing. And, you know, a briefing isn't an audit. And yet the colleges are such an important element that we're looking at. Is there a possibility of upgrading that to be a little bit more comprehensive in its approach to the colleges? I remember in previous sessions we've actually had a very comprehensive audit across the whole span of colleges and all the link-ups between the colleges and how they're all doing. And rather than seeing them one by one, we saw them all together and therefore could understand the whole issue around colleges and what they're facing. Because one size doesn't fit all. Not all colleges are in the same state.
I will bring Mark in a moment. Actually, he's leading much of our work on education in colleges, especially. In terms of, firstly, the nature of the style of output that we produced, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we do like to retain a degree of flexibility of the style of audit output that we use, depending on variables that we either encounter or we know we're going to encounter during the audit. Perhaps a good example, and I think we may have spoken about this relatively recently, Mr Beattie, the Council Commission and I published a joint briefing in the last couple of months on additional support for learning. And we chose a briefing for that output because we knew from our early work the data wasn't strong enough in order to make strong audit judgments that you would more typically see in a performance audit. Firstly, on education and skills reform, I think perhaps captures, I think what we're beginning to see is there have been many statements of intent or ambition around education and skills reform, but perhaps not yet the progress that would have been intended. And that lends itself to a performance audit whereby a new policy has been implemented and an audit will come along retrospectively to more typically and make judgments based on evidence. We think we're not quite at that stage for education and skills reform just because of where the system currently operates, and that lends itself more to a briefing. As ever, there's an opportunity for sequencing, that a briefing can lead, and has done many times over the years from audit work, to a more detailed performance audit in due course if there's a timeline of anticipated implementation and evidence to support those judgments. Mark may want to speak more about the colleges and I suppose the history of some of our work. The last thing I would say before passing to Mark is I know the Public Audit Committee is familiar with the Scotland's colleges through many of the evidence-taking sessions that you've had of the scale of the challenges that exist in that sector. We're witnessing some of those challenges, particularly through our audit work and our reporting, is that some of the capacity constraints, some of the difficult decisions that Scotland's colleges are having to make, that the traditional timeline of audit reporting is out of sync. So so audits are not yet being completed at the pace that we were used to, and there's a range of factors. But that's also partly influencing just whether we've got a complete suite of evidence to do what I think you're referring to as the more traditional sectoral overview report of Scotland's colleges. Through this audit programme, and I think you've seen in recent years, we remain committed to auditing and reporting on Scotland's colleges, and we just want to make sure that we find the right way of doing that through our work programme. But Mark can say more on that, I'm quite sure.
Yes, thanks, Mr Beattie. Your comments are very timely. As you'll see from the paper, that we're still in the process of finalising the scope for the work, but we anticipate this year that we will have, at the moment we have 17 of the 19 colleges, so timelines have caught up a little bit, and hopefully we'll have a more comprehensive picture here. We're also considering the extent to which we comment on how the financial situation may be or may not be impacting on performance, and what the longer term impacts of some of that might be for both the sector and more widely. It is worth noting, of course, that the timing of these reports is such that by the time we bring this report to you, we'll be talking about a financial year end of last year, 2023-24. So we have to make a judgment about how much work we can squeeze in before it becomes almost past its best, so to speak. So we do need to schedule it. So there is a little bit of a time pressure built into this, but we've been discussing with the Auditor General this year about how we might look at shifting the focus of the college's output in future years. But this year I'm hoping that we will have a more comprehensive picture for you.
Certainly it would be useful to see the picture right across the board, as opposed to snapshots of individual colleges, which are useful and important. But the whole sector really is something we'd like to see, the overall health, financial health, and what the performance is. It's not just about finance, it's also about the performance.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to ask Graham Simpson to put some questions to you. Graham.
Thanks very much, Convener. Auditor General, I noticed that one of the audits that you're due to publish again in May is on the Scottish National Investment Bank. Now, that was formed in November 2020. It's had 2 permanent chief execs. It's had an interim chief exec. The current chief exec is about to retire, so it will be on its 4th chief exec in less than 5 years. So for me, that's an issue. I just wonder, again, I know you can't tell us exactly what's going to be in that audit, but I just wonder what the kind of level of detail that's going to be in it. Are you looking at individual investments that the bank has made and the value for money they represent? Is that the kind of thing you're looking at?
So the reason for picking this audit topic is that we felt it was such a significant development of the application of public services, public funding in Scotland. I think when the bank, as they like to be referred to, was created, there was a trajectory of up to £1 billion of capitalisation. So a significant use of public money, and perhaps not surprisingly, Mr Simpson, we want take an audit perspective of, was that on track? Was it was the structures, was the governance, the decision making, some of the accountability arrangements that you refer to, were those operating effectively? Their environment is evolving, so whether it's kind of leadership arrangements or some of the aspirations that the bank has in terms of what activities it can do, the regulation that it will be subject to is changing. So we've sought to explore much of that through the performance audit that we've undertaken. In structuring and setting out the scope for the work, what we stepped back from, for good reason, and Alison can say some more about this, was not looking at individual investments, because I think perhaps through our experience of auditing the enterprise agencies in Scotland, there's a degree of inevitability that some investments will be unsuccessful. And we see that through the reporting that the enterprise agencies do, that some will be unsuccessful, and that means a loss of public money. And that's and there's a degree of risk and reward associated with that. For those that are successful, they'll produce from startups to successful businesses over the longer term, and a return in some of those high-paid jobs and for Scotland over the years to come. Having said that, we do have some case studies in the report that I'm sure will be of interest to the committee on some of those high-profile investments. And we set out in the report how those decision-making processes operate within the bank, the important role that the investment committee has within the organisation, who's on these committees, the information that they get, the structures, the processes. So I hope that will be of interest to the committee and more widely about just how this very important piece of investment, public sector architecture in Scotland is operating. But I will pass to Alison just if there's anything that you want to add.
Thank you. I would just emphasise that we have been looking more at that overall system level about what are the arrangements in place to ensure that any investment decision that is made is robust and gives that assurance of due consideration of value for money and use of public money, recognising, as Stephen has said, that there is always a factor of risk that is different in the nature of the bank's undertakings than there will be for other public bodies. You'll see a range of case studies there alongside, and we have really looked at, I suppose one of the things that's particularly interesting is this is an organisation that brings together a public service culture with a culture of financial services and financial services regulation. So it's been particularly interesting looking at how some of those practices from financial services governance have come to play, and there may be lessons that the rest of the public sector can learn from the application of those.
Okay, thanks. I'm really looking forward to seeing that piece of work. I'll move on to something else then. You're also going to be doing an audit on resilience in flooding. And I know that's of interest to other members. I know Mr. Beattie has a case study he probably wants to mention. We were chatting earlier. Mr. McMillan also has a case study in his patch. And indeed, the convener and myself have a great interest in the Grangemouth scheme. There's a big scheme being planned there. So I just wonder at the level of detail that you're going to be going into in this piece of work. Will you be looking at individual schemes like that, like Grangemouth, for example, which is going to be using a lot of public money? How will your work link in with your planned work on climate change as well? And are you going to be looking at case studies, examples of work that have already happened, and looking at where you think things have worked, things have not worked?
Yes. So this report on building resilience to flooding is part of our programme of work around climate change, and it reflects that, despite whatever efforts we make to mitigate the effects of climate change is with us, and it's the extent to which Scotland's communities are prepared both to prevent but also to recover from flooding events. The report primarily looks at how that system operates in Scotland with the relevant public bodies, the role that the Scottish Government plays, together with Scotland's local authorities, Scottish Environment Protection Agency and Scottish Water are all key organisations in how this system works. We do have some case studies that have explored some of the really dreadful events that we've witnessed in recent times. Brecon especially is perhaps the most recent example of where a community has been impacted by flooding. So we set some of that out. And further, Mr Simpson, I think perhaps in some of the high-profile flood prevention investments that have been made, we look to step back slightly to say, how is that all operating? The committee will be familiar with, not so much through our own audit reporting of flooding defences, but other large capital investment projects that have seen cost growth in recent times through build cost inflation, supplier arrangements. So again, that's a feature of our report. As ever with our performance audit reports, we make a number of recommendations to the Scottish Government and public bodies on how this system might better operate to ensure that Scotland is more prepared to prevent and to recover from flooding in future. Timeline for that, I think we expect to be publishing the report just at the end of August, shortly in advance of the Parliament returning after summer recess.
Okay. I mean, I said earlier that these schemes can they can use up an awful lot of public money. So is your report going to be looking at who is responsible for spending that money and developing the schemes?
Yeah, Alison might want to say a bit more, but we're absolutely looking at where the money has come from and some of the growth and the cost of some of these flood defences arrangements. But we'll get into more detail on that when we brief you in due course. But if there's anything you want to add, Alison.
Yeah, thank you. Just briefly, I think that the report will be a comprehensive study, and one of the particular things driving the timing of this piece is that the national policy approach is moving from one of management and prevention to resilience, and we're looking at what that means in terms of obviously as flooding events become even more serious and more significant. There's a limit to which those can actually be prevented from damage, but how do we move to a position where Scotland is more resilient to these events? And the Scottish Government has recently published its flooding resilience strategy, so we will be looking at that and the approach that's set out there. It is a joint piece with the Accounts Commission, so we have done some case studies with individual local authorities, and that's really helped us look at how local government is an actor in this system and what are the relevant the respective roles and responsibilities. And there are some case studies, and actually I think we're planning to publish some additional case studies out with the report, just because we have gathered some really interesting pieces, and there's more there than we could probably put in an easily digestible report. So there will be further resources made available on publication, going into more detail on some specific areas.
Okay. Before I move on, Convener, I don't know if others want to come in.
I'm going to invite, first of all, Colin Beattie, and then I'll invite Stuart Millen too to raise some questions in this area with you. Colin.
As Graham Simpson mentioned, I do have an interest in my own area for the Musselburgh Flood Protection Scheme. I don't know whether you've looked at that at all. It was a relatively small scheme that's now, depending on how many options are taken, well over £100 million. Government finance appears to me to be uncertain, or at best indicative, and the scheme has taken about 3 years to get to where it is, mainly due to objections that were raised locally, and the whole process has been quite Byzantine in terms of its complexity of how it's progressed through the system, and controversial that third-party interested parties have been part of the decision-making process, which has been subject to objections as well. I don't know whether you've looked at that sort of scheme, but it's certainly one of the more complicated ones in the go at the moment, both financially and technically.
So I'm happy to respond briefly, and Alison might want to say a word or two. So we don't have a case study per se on Musselburgh flood prevention arrangements, Mr. Beattie, but many of the circumstances that you describe are consistent with what we've seen across Scotland in terms of how flood prevention investment is operating, the complexity, the duration, the number of different bodies, a lack of clarity around roles and responsibilities is, not to give too much away, is likely to be a key theme coming out of the report. And perhaps the degree of urgency that's now required to resolve these arrangements, especially with the pace of change of climate change. It would be a dreadful set of circumstances if a flooding event took place in the midst of a protracted, delayed flooding scheme. So keen that our audit report has impact, and hopefully, acts as a useful tool to resolve some of the issues that you might have seen borne out through in the circumstances in Musselburgh.
Look forward to seeing the report.
And Stuart McMillan. Stuart.
Convener. In terms of your case studies, have you looked at anything that's taken place in Inverclyde? The reason why I'm asking that is I think certainly, usually when I come to this committee, I've got something to complain about that's happened, but I would suggest there's actually some excellent practice that's taken place, particularly with the Scottish Water flood prevention scheme that took place along the A8. So the amount of joint working and partnership working that Scottish Water had to undertake with regards to the local authority, with regards to Transport Scotland and Amy and others, I would suggest there's probably a good model to be looked at and potentially replicated across the country.
I'm very grateful to you for highlighting that to us. Actually, I think we will, as Alison mentions, inevitably there's a degree of, we're presented sometimes with too much material with which to capture in a single report. I think where we've got to with this output is trying to find additional ways with which to convey circumstances. So if we'll take that away and do some further research actually and look to find a way with which we can set that out in our reporting. But thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
That's useful. I'm going to turn back now. We're going to turn back now to Graham Simpson, who's got a couple of other areas he wants to raise with you. Graham.
Yeah, well, just one more actually. That's in relation to your planned audit on best value in policing, which you're going to do in conjunction with HM Inspector of Constabulary Scotland. Our predecessor committee, in its legacy report, I think, said that the committee was strongly of the view that there needs to be a full and comprehensive review of police governance and accountability arrangements. So I guess my question is that something you're going to be looking at? And when you're answering that question, if you could just tell us how you are going to be working with HM Inspector of Constabulary.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Simpson. I recall clearly the view of the predecessor committee. There needed to be, I think at the time, quite an urgent review of police governance and accountability arrangements. And I think I remember saying very early on in my tenure that I wanted to take a bit of time before undertaking more detailed audit work on Scottish Police Authority and Police Scotland. And the reason for that was because I think I had seen signs of stability in some of the decision-making arrangements within policing and the SPA, the relationships between those two organisations. Actually, and I'm satisfied that that's kind of been borne out. I think what we have seen is really through many of the audit reporting that have been produced through the work of the external auditors is confirmation that policing will always be complex, hugely important, uniquely placed in terms of the powers that it has. But for some of the members of this committee and who were on the predecessor committee will recall what we were in was a cycle of annual reporting, of Section 22 reporting on policing in Scotland. Real challenges, relationship issues, governance, leadership concerns, financial position concern, all of which at that time, absolutely right, deserved annual scrutiny from the Public Audit Committee. And I remember it well. At that time I was the appointed external auditor of Scottish Police Authority. Now feels the right time, together with, as the Police and Fire Reform Act requires of me, to work with the Chief Inspector of Constabulary to do a wider piece of work that will capture governance and accountability, performance, use of resources, their financial planning, financial sustainability. So I think what will come back to the committee is a much broader piece of work, much more rounded about how policing is performing and how well placed the service is into the future to respond to the needs of communities, how they're managing their finances, some of their plans for their estate as well, together with the use of technology. So very much looking forward to that work progressing. We are in regular engagement with HMICS about how progressing an experienced audit team working closely with the Chief Inspector's team and engaging with both SPA and Police Scotland. So anticipating that will be a report again in January 2026.
Okay, so you will be looking at things like the condition of the police estate, like police stations, crumbling police stations in a lot of cases.
Perhaps not directly. So I think the ownership of the estate is it's a matter for the police and the SPA ultimately as the oversight organisation. What we want to see is just as on that example, what are their plans for how they will deliver policing in the future? What does that mean? And I think I've seen some of the examples of the police have said some of that I think quite recently about their plans specifically for some of the estate, where they'll invest, where they'll be disposing. So our audit, just one part of it, will look at how they've gone through that process, how that links with their service requirements and their financial position in the round. So yeah, it will be a part of it, but we won't perhaps doing our own condition analysis of that. We're content that that's a matter for police themselves.
But when you've looked at, for instance, colleges, you have looked at the condition of the estate. You've mentioned that in previous reports.
To avoid any confusion, yes, we will do the same things. So it will be with the colleges' work. The colleges themselves have done the estate condition surveys, and with the same principle for policing. Does the organisation know how it's going to deliver policing services? Where is it going? What are the demands of local population? And these are the factors that we'll be considering about. Really, are the hallmarks of best value arrangements in the round.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I'm now going to invite Stuart McMillan to put a final series of questions to you. Stuart.
Okay, thank you, Convener. So everyone will be very much aware of the work that yourselves have undertaken with regards to the Glen Sannox and the Glen Rosa, and also you are planning to produce a performance report around about February of next year. Can you provide some further information with regards to what specifics you'll be looking at with regards to that future work?
Yeah, very much so. I'll bring Alison and actually set out that in detail for the committee. This is a continuation of a long-standing commitment that I've made to the Public Audit Committee that I would produce a performance report upon the completion of both vessels. We have commented regularly on progress and challenges that were happening. Clearly, we've seen the launch of Glen Sannox now in operation, and we want to produce a report that captures the totality of investment, any lessons that can be learned and applied, and we'll do that when Glen Rosa is complete, Mr McMillan. I think there is, I've no insight, certainly not beyond that of the Public Audit Committee of timescales, so, but just note that there's perhaps some uncertainty if it will be February. I think what we want to make sure is, given what we've seen of some of the timescales have changed over the years for the completion of the vessels, is that we're not premature in committing to a publication date if the completion date of the vessel changes. So we'll keep close track of that and keep the Public Audit Committee updated. But I'll bring Alison in just to say a bit more about where our work might take us.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, just to say that this audit is still being planned and scoped, so no final decisions have been taken as yet on exactly what it will cover. We are, as we've highlighted in the slides, particularly interested in looking at the costs, the final costs, and also the lessons learned, and recognising the lessons learned for the Scottish Government and wider delivery partners who are involved, including CMAL and Transport Scotland. We will also be seeing alongside, while this audit's ongoing, the forensic review is underway that the Scottish Government has commissioned. So we will take account of that work as well. We will likely produce a separate output for the committee on that review. We can't say any more about it at the moment because that work has not been precisely scoped. The phase 1 is about to complete, which was in terms of ascertaining what data was available in order to then be able to ascertain the nature of the work, the forensic analysis that could then be undertaken on the payments, and we would be looking at commenting on that phase 2 analysis. But we will be looking at this in the round, and it's one where it feels a little bit different for us in the audit teams in that we're doing this in real time and responding to the events as we get the further clarification on timings around Glen Rosa. But we would be obviously very interested in what the committee would like to consider before the end of the parliamentary term, and how we build that into our plans and what we're able to share with you and what ability you then have to scrutinise it. But it may be that if events out with our control may mean that we aren't able to undertake the full audit work and report on it until after the 26th election.
Okay, no, thank you for that. That's very helpful. With regards to also the finances, but also the lessons learned, and I'm not sure if this is work that's already going to be taking place through the forensic analysis or not, but it probably would be worthwhile to look at, and I'm not making any accusations here, I hasten to add, but just in terms of where money has been spent, to look at the contracts that were signed with regards to the external contractors. Because also there clearly have been a wide range of external contractors that have been involved in the building of the Glen Sannox and also the Glen Rosa. And obviously with the Rosa still being worked on, whereas the Sannox clearly isn't. So I think if you were to maybe look at that with regards to the Sannox in the first instance, I think that would probably then help with regards to the lessons learned if that piece of work is undertaken with regards to the Rosa.
That's very helpful, thank you. I think I guess, much as any recommendations we make for lessons learned, just keen to see, I suppose, the evolution of practice and arrangements within Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow from both vessels, and then especially since the intervening period from Glen Sannox completed, and what that means for processes for Glen Rosa. So that's a useful steer, thank you.
But also just in terms of that, I know also when Audit Scotland it's about best value, it's not about what's cheapest. And I don't imagine you've got somebody who has worked in shipbuilding within Audit Scotland, so you'll know that answer, I would. But I genuinely think that in terms of the best value approach, looking at the contracts, not solely just to look at the numbers, but also in terms of the numbers of staff and contractors that actually have been brought in, those who were then let go, also the range of salaries that were also on offer. Because I think we all recognise that in terms of the additional costs that have been borne by the taxpayer with regards to the building, certainly of the Sannox, but also now of the Rosa. And the lessons learned element is hugely important in this. And I think as a good starting point, the external contract will certainly be worthwhile looking at.
Thank you.
Thanks. Also, just kind of linked to this, is you're looking at the sponsorship arrangements as well with the Scottish Government. The committee is certainly keen to get a bit more information with regards to that range of activity also.
Yeah, I'm happy to start on this, and I think it's been a long-term shared interest of mine and the committee on how well sponsorship arrangements are working within the Scottish Government and its bodies. So we have, it's a theme we've returned to in a number of our reports over the years. The committee, recall, has seen some of the consultant reports that the Scottish Government has taken, how well those recommendations have been implemented. And I think you've heard the former Permanent Secretary give you an update on that's been applied. We want to take a view on that, and that's what we intend to do during the annual audit of the Scottish Government, exploring the effectiveness of those arrangements with public bodies. The Scottish Government's governance arrangements have evolved a number of times. Alison's mentioned already some of the Director General arrangements, the escalation that exists to the Executive Board of the Scottish Government Assurance and Audit Committee, and so forth. So it feels timely for us to I think we're now perhaps 3 years on since the report was produced by Eleanor Ryan with the recommendations. Have those been implemented? So that's what we want to do during this piece of work, Mr McMillan, to our governance and sponsorship arrangements operating effectively within the Scottish Government and its sphere of public bodies. And we'll be reporting that to the committee in October.
Okay, no, that's helpful. I think certainly one element that really has come up, certainly in my short time being back on this committee, was the issue of obviously people coming and going within these bodies. Now, I understand why. Obviously, I mean, a wide range of factors as to why someone leaves a particular role and goes into a different role. And it is also very common within the civil service for staff to be shuffled around. But in terms of these sponsorship arrangements and the folk who work purely in this sphere, I'd be keen to explore as to whether there is some type of mechanism that the normal rules wouldn't apply if there are staff who have built up such an expertise and are considered to be high performers within that area, for them to try to see out that particular project as compared to then move to something else. Now, personal circumstances will obviously dictate to that as well, but if it's you want folk who are actually doing a very good job to remain in that, to see the project through.
Very keen to look at that through this work, and I think as you allude to, it's absolutely a feature of how the civil service operates, that civil servants will move from one policy area to another to gain that rounded experience, and I don't suspect for a minute that will change. I think that's just a feature of how the civil service operates. But the other part is equally true. That for sponsorship to operate effectively, and this was one of the points that was captured in Eleanor Ryan's report, that there had been a significant turnover of sponsorship responsibilities within the Scottish Government, that people were new into post. And I think, as you say, change happens, for a variety of reasons, but that the architecture around that change is robust enough to cope with it. So people are properly inducted, trained, supported, and the right experience is applied through, I think, some of the risk analysis that you heard from, for example, the Director General for Net Zero, I think, talked about some of this to the committee in response to sponsorship arrangements for the Water Industry Commission for Scotland, how that hadn't operated effectively. So keen to explore, is the Scottish Government resilient enough to cope with change, and what training arrangements and how that's operating. So yes, I think it's very relevant, the points you make, actually, and looking to explore that through the audit.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Before we finish up this morning, can I just go back to the Ferguson Marine situation and just ask, and I should know the answer, I'm asking you nonetheless, the forensic audit of the pre-nationalisation period, FML, have those forensic auditors been appointed, and if so, who are they? And secondly, if they have, and we know who they are, what stage, you mentioned about a scoping exercise, an understanding of what documentation was available and so on. It would just be helpful on the record just to learn a little bit more about that and what your anticipation is of when they will report.
Alison might want to say some of the detail on this, Convener, but yes, the Scottish Government have appointed a firm of forensic accountants, Grant Thornton, to undertake that work. The sequencing of it, I think, I'll perhaps pass to Alison, actually, can say more rather than me.
Yes, thanks. Our understanding is that the engagement is in 2 phases. So phase 1 of the engagement, which on our understanding is due to conclude today as the end of April, was to ascertain what data and information was available on those payments, and that would then be used as a basis for the contracted firm to come forward with, I suppose, a proposal as to what work they will be able to do based on the data and evidence that they've been able to gather and uncover. We don't have, obviously, the timelines then to which they will produce that will be dependent on the scope. So there's still quite a lot of unknowns in terms of what that work will be. We are anticipating that it will take another at least 2-3 months for that work to conclude, but we haven't had any confirmation of timescales, and I think it's just because those conversations can't take place between Scottish Government and Grant Thornton until they've considered the phase 1 report and outputs. But certainly our intention is that we will then produce an output for the committee based on that phase 2 work. I'm saying output because, again, we're not entirely sure what that might look like yet until we know what the phase 2 work may be. But the sorts of elements we would be considering would be around, I suppose, the scope of the work that's been undertaken, and then the assurance that we can provide back to you on that work. But we'll obviously keep you updated as we receive further clarification from the Scottish Government.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've described it as an assurance exercise by Audit Scotland, isn't it, into this work that's been commissioned by an external firm of accountants.
And you'll recall, Convener, that there was much to and fro about how this work could be undertaken, and it was, as the Scottish Government confirmed and engaged with this committee and ourselves, that I didn't have the powers to do this because Ferguson Marine Engineering Limited wasn't a public body, had gone into liquidation. To bring it back to be created as a public body almost would effectively a cumbersome and not necessarily certain that it would have delivered the outcome that was, I think, what we're all looking for, is that assessment of where the money was spent, what it was spent on, and I think the mechanism that we have with forensic accountants undertaking the work commissioned by the Scottish Government, but with the additional assurance from ourselves, hopefully will provide the Public Audit Committee with the opportunity to explore the conclusions of that work.
And again, just my final question, really, you may not be able to answer this in either the first or the second part, but is there going to be, is it purely a desktop exercise, or, for example, are people like Jim McCall, the former owner of the yard, going to be interviewed?
So I don't know the detail of that. I think that's something we'd need to, like, probably, as Alison mentioned, the next phase of this work. It depends what you define as desktop. We know that they have access to the financial records, so they are undertaking that activity. But I think it probably rubs up against the extent of our engagement and detail at the moment.
Okay, and sorry, my final question is, but your expectation, this morning has been all about the work that you are able to carry out as Audit Scotland before we hit the buffer of March of next year when the Parliament dissolves and we go into an election mode. Is your working expectation anyway that this assurance work that you will be able to provide on the pre-nationalisation phase of Ferguson Marine, that will be available before we hit that buffer?
I think probably all I can say is we hope so, Convener.
Okay.
We hope so. I think I wouldn't want to be definitive, given that it's others that are carrying out the work rather than ourselves.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, thanks very much for your cooperation on that final round of questions and on all the other questions that we've put to you this morning. It's been extremely useful for us. And so can I thank Mark McPherson, Alison Cumming and Auditor General Yu for being available this morning to give us that insight into your work programme. It is a consultation process, and we'll need to consider how best we can canvass the views of other parts of the Parliament to maybe feed back to you their views on the indicative work programme. So thank you very much once again, and I will now move the committee into private session.